statement says, for solar energy to reach a contracting muscle in your arm, chemiosmosis must occur. So that means you have to know what that actually is. Does anyone want to tell me what chemiosmosis is? Yeah, go ahead. Right, so chemiosmosis couples hydrogen ion movement through ATP synthase with ADP and a phosphate group joining. So this is how ATP synthesis occurs. So, do I have to make ATP for the sun's energy to get to your contracting muscle? Why, yes, I do. That's how it's going to get there. So that is definitely true. Now, on this point, I will remind you, when I first introduced this idea, I said, I really like this kind of a question. Show me how the energy from the sun gets to the contracting muscle in your arm. There was a question in the text that was about a cougar. I would absolutely ask you to show me that with like a little flow chart or with pictures or however you wanted to represent it. Now, number 2 and 3 we'll talk about together because they're about basically the same thing. In 2, I ask you about the overall reactants, and 3, I ask you about the overall products. And I use the word overall because I'm referring to when I write the photosynthesis reaction, what's actually in it. That makes number 2 true. Absolutely, CO2 gas and H2O liquid are the reactants for photosynthesis. Now, a few people asked me, wouldn't I have to include solar energy as well? And you would. I'm not including everything that could possibly be there. Since energy isn't a substance, though, I usually use the word reactant for substances only. Now, overall products of photosynthesis do not include ATP and NADPH. This one is false. It is true that the light reaction, so part 1, makes those substances. So they are made during photosynthesis, but then they're used in the Calvin-Benson cycle or the second part, the dark reaction, whatever you want to call it. So in the overall reaction, I don't see them because I've made them and then used them up right away. Number 4 asks about how ATP provides energy. And I'm going to highlight the part at the end. ATP does have 3 phosphate groups, but is it going to release all 3 of them? It is not. And so if we change that 3 to a 1, then that would be true. The cycle is ATP to ADP. So we're always talking about removing 1 phosphate group or adding 1 phosphate group back. Number 5 says NADPH, and I'm going to highlight the fact that it has the H. When things already have the hydrogen added onto them, they are reduced. Remember, reducing or reduction is when you gain something. So something that is reduced has reducing power. NADP positive is definitely oxidized. Oxidized molecules are ones that have lost something. We can see it has lost that hydrogen. So this is true. Now number 6 is referring to the pictures, just so we can go over a bit of vocabulary. Part A and Part B are the other way around. Part A is the stroma, Part B are the thylakoids. Now over here, Part C is the matrix, Part D is the cristae of the mitochondria. So this statement is false. It's not completely false, it's just half false. And then number 7 asks about the pictures again. It says the function of Part A is to reduce carbon dioxide. So let's ask ourselves, what does that mean? Reducing means I'm adding something to it. And that's what happens during the Calvin cycle. During the Calvin cycle, I take CO2 and I make a carbohydrate that has C and H and O. So I'm adding things to it. So that is definitely true. Now up to that point, up to number 7, does anyone want to ask anything about any of the statements that are on here? So then number 8 says the reduction of NADP positive happens during the Calvin cycle. Now that molecule could be reduced. It doesn't have an H. I could add one. So we got to ask ourselves, does it actually happen during the Calvin cycle? The Calvin cycle is part 2. We know that NADPH gets made and then used up during photosynthesis. So it can't be happening during the Calvin cycle. If we replace that with photolysis or part 1 or the light-dependent reaction, whatever you want to call the first part, that's when the reduction of NADP positive happens. So 8 is false. Number 9, the production of ATP happens during photolysis. That is definitely true. So during photolysis, which is the first part, we're making ATP. I'm going to use it later in the second part. Now number 10, a number of people asked me about the very last textbook question, the one that had dots and colors of light and a line, and that's what this is really getting at. My question is, or my statement is, leaves are green because chlorophyll absorbs green light. And I'm going to highlight that word. It's the opposite. Whatever color of light a plant doesn't absorb, so whatever color of light is reflected, is the color that you actually see. So chlorophyll does not absorb green light. It is the color that is the least important for chlorophyll. So that is why plants with chlorophyll look green. So that makes this one false. Number 11 is asking about the light-independent reaction. So this is the Calvin cycle, part 2. And it says that it occurs during the day and night, which is definitely possible. In all eukaryotic organisms, also definitely possible. So this can be true. Now I'm just going to point out a word that I often use at the same time as this. Sometimes I will say instead of eukaryotic, what's my spelling up to today? I'll use the words autotrophic or heterotrophic. Remember, autotrophic means makes their own food. Heterotrophic means does not make their own food. Autotrophs can do both photosynthesis and cell respiration. Heterotrophs can only do cell respiration. Now, number 12 is asking about chemiosmosis. And number 12, maybe on the surface, looks like it's true, but I'm going to say it's false because it's not actually hydrogen ions that are producing ATP. It is when their movement through ATP synthase produces ATP. The hydrogen ions themselves aren't even touching ATP. They move through the structure, ATP synthase, and it has a mechanism that attaches ADP and phosphate. Now number 13 is asking about replacing lost electrons. Photosystem 2 is the one that comes first in order. And so it definitely decomposed a molecule of water to replace the electrons that were lost. If I was talking about photosystem 1, its electrons are the ones that came from photosystem 2. For number 14, oxygen is produced in the thylakoid membranes while glucose is produced in the stroma. It's true. Oxygen happens during photolysis, part 1. Glucose comes from the Calvin-Benson cycle, part 2, and that's where they happen. Number 15, I just answered by talking about it earlier. It's the other way around. Electrons go from photosystem 2 to photosystem 1. So the second one comes first in the order of happening. Number 16 is almost true, except for one word. If I changed the word oxidize to reduce, it would be true. Reducing is when you gain things, oxidizing is when you lose things. Number 17 is a big, huge, long statement. What I want you to recognize is that in the light-independent reaction, so the Calvin cycle, I take carbon dioxide, I combine it with RuBP, that's the molecule that accepts it, and eventually I make things that have 3 atoms of carbon. Then, after the second round, I will eventually make a molecule that has 6 atoms of carbon. So this is true. One round of the Calvin cycle makes something with 3 atoms of carbon. And then once it happens again, I have another one of those pieces. I have 6 atoms of carbon. And the reason we're focusing on that is because glucose has 6 atoms of carbon. And then finally, an increase in temperature could increase the rate of photosynthesis. That's true. The curve looks like that for temperature. Increasing the temperature will help photosynthesis to a point. Increasing it too high will cause the rate to decrease because enzymes will be denatured. But since I used the word could and not will always 100% of the time, that makes this statement true. All right, so what you all needed to do over the last few minutes was to look in your textbook at the 3 different pathways that we could discuss when we're talking about cellular respiration. So the 3 different pathways were aerobic, anaerobic, and fermentation. And the reason I put as the title for this lesson is Destiny is because I'm asking, where does glucose go? What's going to happen? What is the destiny of glucose? How is it going to be used? Now we're going to talk about each of these processes very specifically, but I wanted to give you the overview right at the beginning so you know that there are different ways that glucose can be used. One thing that's common for all of them is that glucose is going to undergo oxidation. We reduced carbon dioxide to make glucose. If I'm going to use glucose and make carbon dioxide, it's the other way around. It's oxidation. So that's true for all of them. Here are the key differences between these things. Aerobic respiration absolutely requires oxygen. If oxygen is unavailable, then aerobic cellular respiration cannot occur. For the other 2, oxygen is not available. And now sometimes people will discuss fermentation as a type of anaerobic cellular respiration, and it's easy to see how they look similar to each other. Usually we refer to anaerobic cellular respiration in organisms that are purposefully doing it without oxygen as their main way of performing cellular respiration, whereas fermentation is usually reserved for situations where the organism normally could use oxygen, but oxygen is unavailable. So I'm just going to add the word unavailable here because a lot of organisms that do fermentation can also do aerobic cellular respiration, whereas anaerobic cellular respiration is really limited to organisms that don't usually do this with oxygen. So in your textbook, you'll notice that it mentions a few specific types of organisms that can do this. So for example, it says, refer to, which page is that? 12. So since we didn't do the textbook in order, we haven't actually done page 12 yet. But we will talk about something called chemosynthesis. It happens with organisms that live at the bottom of the ocean where light is not a choice, so they can't perform photosynthesis. But generally, we are talking about bacteria. So you'll notice your textbook mentions chemosynthetic organisms, nitrogen-fixing bacteria, soil bacteria, in general, bacteria. It also mentions this word, archaea. You might have learned in the past that there were 5 kingdoms: plants, animals, fungus, protists, bacteria or unicellular things. And more recently, things have been rearranged slightly differently so that there are actually two categories of bacteria. So bacteria and archaebacteria are two different kingdoms, let's say, of bacteria. They're all unicellular organisms, but they have some fairly characteristic structural differences. We'll talk about that later when we talk about classifying organisms. I just wanted you to know that if you see archaea or archaebacteria, we're talking about bacteria, and we're probably talking about things that perform anaerobic cellular respiration. Fermentation happens in different types of organisms. So fermentation is the kind of thing that happens in yeast. Fermentation is also the kind of thing that happens in something called lactobacillus. That's what makes milk go sour. And fermentation also happens in your muscles when you have exercised very strenuously and you start to feel pain in them. And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about it briefly in this unit, and then our next chapter is muscles, and we'll talk about it even more then. But these are the three destinies, let's say, of glucose. We're always going to be oxidizing it, but how we're going to oxidize it will change depending on whether oxygen is present or oxygen is not present. So, I just want to come back to this word. If you have taken some chemistry, you might be aware that in the past, scientists may have thought that only oxygen could perform oxidation, and that's why it's called that. And so please do not get the misconception that if there's no oxygen, I can't oxidize something. Oxidation doesn't necessarily have to do with oxygen. It just means that I'm losing something. So remember, oil rig, oxidation is loss. I'm losing something if I'm undergoing oxidation. Does anyone want to ask any questions about the three pathways that we're going to discuss? All right. So, what happens during cellular respiration? Well, here's what will happen if everything that we want is available. One molecule of glucose, which is C6H12O6, and it's a solid, will react with 6 molecules of oxygen, which is a gas. Now those are the same two things that I produced during photosynthesis. I will get 6 molecules of CO2 gas, 6 molecules of liquid water, and then I'm going to get something else. I'm going to get, if I'm lucky, 36 ATPs. Now 36 ATP is what you get in a eukaryotic organism when oxygen is available. And then for some of the other scenarios, a different amount of ATP is being produced. And then I'm highlighting over here that there is some waste heat produced. I mentioned earlier when we talked about the overview, anytime energy changes from one form to another, there's waste heat being produced, but it's especially noticeable here. The other thing I want to remind you of is the picture at the bottom. So this is a mitochondrion when there is one of them. It's mitochondria if there are several of them. And in your mitochondrion, there are two things that interest us quite a bit. The matrix, which is the center portion, and the cristae, that's the wavy internal membrane. And so much like the chloroplast has the fluid part, the stroma, and the membrane, thylakoids, mitochondria has the same deal. So if I was going to compare, I'm going to say the stroma and the matrix kind of have something in common. The cristae and the thylakoids have something in common. So that you can see what's happening overall in these places. In the stroma, we know this because you're having a quest tomorrow. In the stroma, CO2 is reduced to a carbohydrate. In the matrix, a carb is oxidized to CO2. See how that happens? The opposite process. In the thylakoid membranes, we know water is oxidized to oxygen, so water loses its hydrogen. In the cristae, guess what happens? Oxygen is reduced to water. So just like I made you look at in your textbook there, how oxidation and reduction are still happening, just in the opposite order, the matrix is doing the opposite of what the stroma does, and the cristae is doing the opposite of what the thylakoids do. And conveniently, cristae and thylakoids are both wavy membranes. Stroma and matrix are both the fluid space around them. Now, does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask about oxidation, reduction, parts of a mitochondrion, maybe part of the cell respiration reaction that you're not sure about? So we need to talk about what's happening to glucose. So there's a picture up here. I wouldn't worry too much about drawing the picture necessarily. It's just there so I can illustrate where things are going. But we're going to use the word metabolism. So I'm going to remind you what that word means. We saw the word metabolism when we talked about enzymes. Metabolism could be catabolism or anabolism. But we know that enzymes can help speed up reactions, either break things apart or put things together. Specifically here, we're going to focus on catabolism, breaking things apart, because that's more or less what's happening for us to get glucose available and then for us to use glucose to produce energy. So, for us to have glucose available to perform cellular respiration, the first thing that has to happen is that poly and disaccharides, which we've already seen, poly means many, saccharide means sugar. So polysaccharides are things that have many units of sugar. Disaccharides are things that have 2. These are broken down into monosaccharides, things that have 1. So I'm just going to remind you of some words that I could use to represent those things. If I'm talking about polysaccharides, I could talk about starch. I could talk about glycogen. Starch is something that a plant normally would have for a storage form, whereas glycogen is generally a polysaccharide that you would find in animals. Now, if I wanted to talk about disaccharides, which you could also have as an intake, this is where I'd be talking about sucrose, lactose, and maltose. And if I was talking about monosaccharides, I'd be talking about things like glucose, fructose, and galactose. So you can take in any type of carbohydrate. So if you look at the packaging on what you're reading, sometimes what you're eating will have glucose flat out, and your body doesn't need to do anything to convert it. A lot of things that have sugar in them have glucose, fructose. You'll see that very frequently on the label. Some things will have sucrose, some things will have starch or glycogen or something that contains them. So the idea is that whatever type of carbohydrate you take in, it becomes a monosaccharide. Now your blood delivers these to your liver, and your liver is a really large organ. It's that guy right there. Your liver is sort of a bit higher up and in front of where your stomach is in your abdominal cavity. Later on this semester, when we dissect things, you will get to see where the liver fits in with everything else in the digestive system. But your liver is incredibly important. It has a function in every single body system that we're going to discuss. So I'm going to point this out now with this word right next to it. Since your liver is involved with all of the body systems we'll discuss, all of them, it is going to be part of a final exam question because I could ask you to talk about all of your body systems. See how great that would work out for me? So, your liver, important. Now, among the million other things that your liver does, your liver can convert the other monosaccharides into glucose. It's a fancy little reaction. I don't need you to be able to list it out step by step. I'm just telling you that that's where that happens. And then eventually your cells will absorb glucose from your blood. And I'm going to mention this word here because we'll see it again later. Whenever things are being absorbed from your blood into a cell, it's because there are capillaries. They're small blood vessels that have really thin walls, and that's how things can get out of your blood and into your cells, because the walls are thin and molecules can pass through. So for us to be able to use glucose, it has to get to your cells. That's the first part. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask about that? So glucose has to get to your cells. Now, cell respiration is not the only thing that could possibly happen to glucose. So what I'll show you on the next slide is what happens if my cells don't need glucose. So what happens if they have enough glucose? Or what happens if they are unable to receive glucose? So one of the things that we'll talk about a little bit later on as well is the idea of insulin and how that could play a role in glucose being absorbed or not being absorbed by your cells. But the idea is that your cells will not always absorb all of the glucose. Sometimes there's too much, or sometimes they're unable to absorb it. So what happens to glucose? I've got some pictures here for you of some things. But there are 4 things that can happen to glucose. The first thing is that it can become glycogen. Your liver and or your muscles your liver or your muscles can have glycogen, which is a polysaccharide stored in them, as a reserve of energy. So sometimes glucose will simply be stored. Now, glycogen can easily be converted back into glucose. And so this is glucose that's ready for basically immediate use. This is your body's on-demand source of energy. Now there's another way besides your liver or your muscles, which I say wrong on purpose for fun. Nobody even laughs sometimes. My other favorite word to say wrong on purpose is the word chlorine, because it really looks like chlorine. Nobody laughs at that either, usually. Now on the bottom I have fat. So you know, these are fat cells. If you look at a fat cell, what you'll see is a bunch of fat and all of the organelles smushed over on one side. So fat cells could be called lipocytes or adipocytes. And I'm showing you these words because you're going to start seeing a lot of words throughout the human physiology unit that have CYTES at the end of them. This little part of a word means cells. So if you see something cyte, it just means that's a cell of some particular kind. And you'll see a lot of words that have that ending on them as we start talking about the different functions and different systems in the human body. Now fat, as opposed to glycogen, is more of a long-term storage option. So if there is more glucose than your body can handle, it will get stored as fat, and it is not as easy to undo this conversion. It's easy for your body to take glycogen, turn it back into glucose, do cell respiration. It's not as easy to do that with a fat cell. That is why it is hard to get rid of fat once it's there. Now the next thing is excretion. So this picture here is of your kidney, and then this cool little thing is called a nephron. We'll talk about both of those things. Your kidneys, you have two of them, your kidneys filter your blood, and inside your kidneys are millions of these tiny little structures. Your blood flows around some tubes, and the tubes either let things from the blood in or put things back, and that's how your urine is formed. So if there is an incredibly large excess of glucose, it will be excreted. Now this is fairly abnormal. It is unusual for a person to excrete glucose. Normally, the only time you would see someone excreting glucose is if the person was diabetic. Now, the last thing that can happen to glucose is good old cell respiration. So we're going to make ATP, and some heat will be produced. So now we're going to talk about the cell respiration part very specifically, now that we know how we get glucose and what happens to it inside of our body. So this is glucose oxidation overview. So remember I said glucose is being oxidized no matter which type of cellular respiration is happening. The thing I'm trying to illustrate with this particular slide is that step one, which is called glycolysis, happens all the time. So glycolysis can happen in any cell realistically. So it doesn't matter if you are a prokaryotic cell, if you are a eukaryotic cell, doesn't matter if you have a mitochondria, doesn't matter if you have oxygen. This is the part that any cell can accomplish. So because oxygen and mitochondria are not required for that part, any cell can accomplish this. Now when fermentation is occurring, it happens after glycolysis. So that's why I put it over here on the side. If aerobic cellular respiration is going to happen, we have to follow a different pathway. Aerobic cellular respiration requires oxygen, like we said, but it also requires a mitochondria. So I put this big box around these two parts to represent mitochondria. Part 2, the citric acid or the Krebs cycle, and part 3, the electron transport chain, happen inside the mitochondria. And so the only types of cells that can perform aerobic cellular respiration this way have to have a mitochondria. So that means eukaryotic cells only could go in this box. Up here, I say any cell, so it could be prokaryotic or eukaryotic, doesn't matter. And remember that Plants and animals are both eukaryotic cells. So just because something is doing photosynthesis doesn't mean it is not also doing cellular respiration. Now, would anybody like to ask any questions at all about the overview, about maybe what type of cell or where things are happening?